Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Dean Smith from the Community of Human and Organizational Learning, and I am doing a very slow introduction while we're admitting everybody from the waiting room. I just want to make sure we have as many in as possible before we get started. And it looks like we've got everybody in. So welcome to today's webinar. We're just thrilled to have LaRhonda Julien from Georgia Transmission Corporation leading this discussion about, and I'm going to paraphrase here, LaRhonda, so if I get it wrong, please forgive me and course correct me if you will, but I think it's all about how do you recognize when there's valuable knowledge to be gathered and assimilated, and then kind of more importantly, how do you put that into practical application and all the ways that we can do that as organizations and as human beings. And so that's one thing. And then the second thing is I appreciate what you're bringing to this dialogue, to this discussion, to this sharing, because I think you have a personal and professional mission to help people be as successful as they possibly can be, both at work and in life. So that was a long road to just say, welcome, LaRhonda, and please take it away from here.
Sure. Thank you so much. And I do have quite a few slides, so hopefully we'll get through all of those in the time that we have. So I'm going to apologize in advance for that. And yes, we're basically going to talk about how we learn things, and we're going to start that off with a little bit of science. So hopefully you all love some science. We'll talk about how we learn things, how that gets encoded into our memories, how our experience factors into that, and then using that knowledge that we have and that experience and culturating that into our environments. And I'll give you some practical applications, as you stated, using things that I've done here at Georgia Transmission. So,
hey, and LaRhonda, is it okay if people raise their hands and ask questions throughout, or would you like to hold those till the end?
they can. I don't know if I'll be able to see them. I guess we can figure that out. So
I will
don't
help
want
with
anybody to get upset if I don't see a hand or something.
I'll keep a lookout too. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So yes, we are going to start off with a little bit of science. And then again, like I said, we're going to move into how information is actually encoded into our brains and then stored for later retrieval, and how we know those impacts of all of those experiences that we have and those things that we've learned, and incorporating those things into our work lives and into our everyday lives. As you all probably know, I'm sure you've heard it a million times, experience is priceless, right? Experience is a great teacher. And whether or not you get that experience through trial and error or lessons that you learn from other people, which is kind of the way I like to learn them, not myself. All of that information, all of that data is very relevant, and we can take and we can put that into practical applications. We can make what we learn actionable and use that to reduce the opportunity that we're going to have any issues or any errors, accidents, incidents later on. So I'm going to share my presentation with you. You all should already be able to see it. Hopefully nobody's having any trouble in that arena. And then we are going to get started here real quickly. So like I said, we are going to start with some science. We're going to talk about neurons in the brain and how the brain functions. So I'll talk to you a little bit about some brain lobes and different activities and how what we learn is attributed to each one of those lobes or each one of those components. So neurons that are in our brain, those neurons receive and they communicate data throughout the brain. The brain itself is blanketed by our cerebral cortex, and there are several subcortical areas. So you've probably heard of those, and we're going to talk a little bit about them, but they lie underneath that blanket. They lie underneath that cerebral cortex, and they are all associated with different brain lobes and how we learn. So when we learn things, it's attributed to those different lobes that are in our brain. The four lobes of the brain are your temporal, your frontal, your parietal, and your occipital lobes. And we can use brain imaging techniques also to understand the brain and how it functions, and how when we learn different things, it sends those signals to those different parts of the brain. And conversely, when the brain is damaged, how we'll see on those images that it won't look the same as it did for a healthy brain, or a brain that was able to function normally. So those neurons that we talked about, they help to shape our experiences. They help us also to increase our chances for survival, right? Because we're learning things, and the more that we learn, the more that we're able to adapt to our environment. Researchers have studied how stimuli travel through those different pathways, or those lobes of the brain, and how that affects our behavior. Because again, if any parts of those different lobes are damaged, then that is going to impact our knowledge and subsequently how we behave. So the brain itself receives information from the environment, and I'll talk to you a little bit later about how that happens. That data comes from what we hear, what we see, what we smell. So all of our senses, that those are stimuli that gets that information into our brain. Our perception of that stimuli, which is what we see and what we hear and what we smell, it influences those lobes. So there's like these neural networks, and all that information travels there. And then that information is processed into our brain, and that's how we gain knowledge. And then again, later on, our experiences, things that we live, come, and they all kind of play really nicely. And then we're able to put all of those things into action, right? We have practical experience now. But everybody perceives things differently. So we're not all perceiving things in the same way. And especially because our experiences are going to be different. And if you have something that you're learning, you might hear it, see it, receive it a different way than I do. And again, you combine all of that, and we could be two people in the same room learning the same thing, hearing the same thing, seeing the same thing, and have two totally different opinions of what we just heard or what actually just happened. So a little bit more on the science. There are three components of our neurons. We have our cell bodies and our dendrites, and our axons are our nerve fibers. So I talked a little bit about how, we're seeing, we're hearing, we're smelling, and that all gets in there, and then it starts traveling, and we process it. And then subsequently, we're able to use that information. So those neurons, their functions can be assessed by separating their components. And those are the three that I just told you about. It helps us to understand how those neurons and that information that we receive impact our behavior and our brain activity and our relationship to other parts of the brain. Because when you see something, even though what you see is associated with one part of the brain, it also has connections in other parts. So if you're seeing something, right, like there's this visual cortex that's happening, well, it might also be associated to what's happening in your auditory cortex or in other places. So you get that primary effect, and then you have some other secondary effects based on that information or that stimuli that you're getting as well. So the neuron receives, processes, and then transfers information to different parts of the brain. The cell body, which is part of that, is located in the middle of the neuron, and it's responsible for the critical operation of the neurons. And then you have your dendrites, and they extend from the cell body, and they acquire data from other neurons. So again, making those connections. And then the axons are the nerve fibers, and they convey messages to other neurons. So if you could kind of see it as a picture, you'll see all of those different things connected in those different ways, and each one of them has a function, and they all work together. Then you have your synapse and your neural circuits and your receptors. So the synapse is the space between the dendrites and the axons. So if you're kind of putting a little picture in your brain, or if you got some pen and paper, you can kind of draw one out there. And then those neurons join together. So everybody gets together and have a party very intentionally. And those clusters or those connections are called neural circuits. So now all of those things have gotten together and you have this circuit. And then those neurons, there are neurons that also exist outside of the brain, and they are called receptors. So tiny bit more science. Talk about the lobes of the brain. So remember that cerebral cortex that I talked about, it covers or it blankets the brain. Well, it's split into 4 parts, which is your temporal lobe, your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, and your occipital lobe. The temporal lobe, it holds your auditory cortex, and damage to the temporal lobe can result in a loss of hearing. So anybody who's lost their hearing, they have some temporal lobe damage. Were you doing that?
Yeah, I have some hearing loss. So I was saying,
Oh.
yeah. Go on.
We'll talk about hearing and attention a little bit later too. And then damage, again, to the temporal lobe can result in a loss of hearing. And then there's something called prosopagnosia, which can also happen when the temporal lobe is damaged. And what it does is it causes people not to be able to identify faces, which I'm sure you probably can't even imagine, but you're not able to identify faces, including your own face or faces of people who are familiar to you, people that you know. Then we have the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe contains your visual cortex, and damage to your occipital lobe can cause blindness. The sensory systems that we talked about a little bit earlier, they're interconnected and they work together to achieve those high levels of cognition. So you've got now your 2 different lobes that we've talked about so far that can impact your hearing or your vision. And so if your hearing or your vision is impaired, then that is going to also affect how you learn things and your behavior and how learning, that whole process, because again, it's a multi-level process, how that takes place. So you may be able to learn some things, but there are other things that you used to be able to learn or that you used to know that you won't be able to recall or do anymore. We have the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe receives information related to hearing and vision and touch and smell. So it's kind of powerful there. And it also is responsible for cognition, so learning functions. And we call it, again, because it is responsible for all of those things, hearing and vision and touch and smell, it's called the executive part of the brain. So almost like it's in charge. And then finally, on the lobe front, we have parietal lobes. Your parietal lobe houses the somatosensory cortex. So your perceptions of touch and taste and pressure and pain are all attributed to this part of the brain. So to sum that all up, you have stimuli that is received from the environment. So those things you hear, you see, you touch, you taste, you smell, they are converted into these electrical signals. And those signals are sent to the brain, and then those neural networks that we talked about, they transform those signals into words and sights and sound. And then it decodes what it means, because we can receive information and we don't always know what it means. Kind of like if you're reading Greek, like I can see the words on the paper, but I have no idea what that means. But your brain helps you to take that information and decode it, figure out the meaning, and then those systems in your brain produce reasoning and memory, like, okay, I know what this means. How can I use this to help me or to do X, Y, and Z? And then you have that memory of that you can retrieve later. That information is then also routed to other centers of the brain, because remember, just because something happens or generates in your visual cortex doesn't mean that it can't also be mapped to other areas to be very useful in those areas as well. And you take that whole picture, all of those things, and then you have a product, if you will, that you can act upon. This is one of my favorite quotes. And I know after all that heavy brain stuff, you're like, mind blown. So we are all still learning, and I am still learning. So thank you, Michelangelo, for that. And we're going to learn a little bit more. We're going to learn about short-term memory and long-term memory. And hopefully this will be helpful as you all are getting ready to go out into the world after this and do some things. You'll be able to take what you've learned and hopefully capitalize on that. So starting with short-term memory is the process that's involved in retaining and retrieving and using information about stimuli and images and events and ideas and skills after the original information is no longer present. So remember, we just talked about all of the stimuli and how we receive those things and all the different cortexes and such. Your memory itself is active anytime some past experience has an effect on the way that you think or behave now or in the future. So your sensory memory in its initial stage holds all incoming information for a few seconds or a fraction of a second. So your short-term memory is just that, very, very short. Your short-term memory stores small amounts of information for a brief period of time. It can hold maybe 5 to 7 items for about 15 to 20 seconds is what the original research kind of said. But now in 2023, because that original research was done back in the 50s, now we have gone down to about 5 to 9 items. So we can kind of remember the length of a phone number, and then from there, about 4 items. So it depends on what we're hearing and what we're trying to remember. So we can remember a number, especially if, you know, kind of the ones on those jingles on TV, like 555-333-3333, right? We can remember that. But if it gets any more complicated to that, it goes from 5 to 9 items all the way down to 4. So short-term memory, initially, we were doing pretty good. We could remember 5 to 7 things for about 15 to 20 seconds. Then we got a tad bit better, but then I'm sure with the invention of technology and all the things that we have to distract us, now we're down to about 4 items that we can remember at a time. So what you can do to kind of help improve your short-term memory is that you can use a concept called chunking. And when you use chunking, you actually use a group of words and put them into phrases or sentences to help you remember information, right? You could be like fruit and apple, number and 5, but you can find ways to chunk information or to chunk data to help you with your short-term memory. In addition to short-term memory, we also have a working memory, and I'll talk to you a little bit about working memory later, but you can think of working memory as a longer form of your short-term memory that can hold information for an extended period of time. And when I say extended, it's not forever, it's just while you're performing a certain function that you'll need quick retrieval from. Like I'm trying to do a multiplication problem and it involves me carrying a 1 or something like that. Like I have to remember to do those different processes. So it can help with something like that. Your working memory is also essential in understanding language and helping you to solve problems and making decisions because it helps with dynamic processing in your brain. So there's this interchange of information that happens between your working memory and your long-term memory that we'll talk about also, called an episodic buffer. So we were here at our short-term memory, which was very short, started at about 15 to 20 seconds, 5 to 7 items. Then, you know, cell phones happened and such, and our short-term memory got a little bit shorter. We got down to about 4 items. But now we're moving into working memory. Your working memory a little bit longer than your short-term memory. So if you're doing something again like multiplication or some other thing that you're trying to do, maybe you're learning a new language, then your working memory can help into that. And then you're transitioning even a little bit more into this buffer between your working and your long-term memory, which is your episodic buffer. Remember, we talked about cortexes and such. If you have any damage to your prefrontal cortex, then that will impair your short-term and your working memory. I know that was a lot, but like I said, we're all still learning. So let's talk a little bit about long-term memory. Your long-term memory is responsible for storing information for long periods of time. So that can be anything from a few minutes to your entire lifetime. I know my dad, who is going to be 74, is always talking to me about stuff when I was little that I do not remember, but he remembers it like it was yesterday. So his long-term memory is doing pretty good. So your long-term memory, something that you just learned all the way through a lifetime, you can recall that data. Your long-term memories from past experience are called episodic memories. So your ability to ride a bike, you always hear people say, you'll never forget how to ride a bike, of course, once you know. But those things are called your episodic memories, or any other things that might involve some type of muscle coordination, maybe swimming, which I'm still working on because, again, I'm still learning. But those things are a part of your episodic memory, and even a part of your procedural memory if you're learning a certain way to do something, like if you're learning a certain dance routine. Another type of long-term memory that you have is your semantic memory, and that's memory for things like facts, like you remember what your address is, or you remember what your birthday is, which I've been telling people all month because my birthday is Monday. So remember what your birthday is, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too, because when it relates to memory and to attention, again, long time ago, we were able to retain lots of information all the time, but now only 7% of people in the world actually remember their birthdays. I don't understand this. But we also remember the names of different objects like bicycles and such. So our long-term memory is like an archive, right, in our little brains that can help us to retrieve stored information and relate it to what's happening at a particular moment. So if something is happening in the moment, you've got to hurry up and jump on a bicycle and go catch the ball that ran out into the street. You're able to do that because you have that muscle memory and that coordination from having done that and learned that a long time ago. So you're able to do that. Your long-term memory can be divided into either explicit or implicit memories. So your explicit memory is things that you're conscious of that you learn, and then your implicit memory are things that you're not conscious of. Your explicit memory can be episodic, so it can be based on personal events, and your semantic memory is based on facts or knowledge, things that you learned. Your implicit memory can be divided into procedural memory, into priming, and into conditioning. So your procedural memory is called like a skill memory because it's a memory for doing things that usually involve learned skills. It actually enables you to be able to carry out things without thinking about what you're doing. Now, we do want you to think about it, but you can actually carry out things without thinking about what you're doing because of your procedural memory. Priming occurs when the presentation of one stimulus changes the way a person responds to another stimulus. And we talked about stimuli a little bit earlier and how we receive information. And then classic conditioning, which we all are probably familiar with from a lot of our early earth scientists and such, that occurs when your neutral stimulus and your conditional stimulus are paired. So the neutral stimulus does not initially result in a response. The conditioning stimulus does result in a response. So your conditional stimulus is linked to emotional reactions to things like, say, I was driving down the street and I got to the stop sign that I know I stopped at. And then I went forward, and then there were these blue lights in the background, and police pulled me over and said I didn't stop at the stop sign, and he gave me a ticket. Well, now every time I get to that same stop sign, I'm going to get that real tight feeling, and I'm going to start looking around like, are there any blue lights here that I need to be checking for? So that is one way that you can kind of look at that conditioning and those emotional reactions that you might have from it. Or you can use, Pavlov. We've used that so many times with the dogs and the tones and such to help you remember conditioning and then the reactions that we have to it. So you can experience emotions triggered by past events when those different stimuli are triggered. We're going to talk a little bit about perception, and perception is also linked to coding. We actually code information based on what we hear and what we see and what we smell. And we talked about that a little bit earlier as well, receiving that stimuli. We're receiving that stimuli and it's coding and encoding things into our brain. So that's a mental approach to coding. That's kind of how it happens, by that information that we receive. That coding takes place in your short-term and your long-term memory. So there's some things that you're going to see, hear, smell, touch that you'll be able to recall immediately because of your short-term memory. And then those same things you'll be able to recall later because of your long-term memory. And some examples of that, say with visual coding, which will be in your short-term memory right now, is if you have a pattern in your mind, like that number that you were trying to remember, 555, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? So you've seen that. Okay, now when I go to my cell phone, I can punch those numbers in. And then your long-term would be, okay, I just started a new job and I've met 50 people on my first day. And there's going to be some people you remember and some people you don't, but those faces that you do remember, that will be attributed to that long-term memory visual coding. Then you have auditory coding. So that's based on things that you hear. An example of some auditory coding in your short-term memory would be, again, if you're trying to remember something that you just heard. An example of auditory coding in your long-term memory is you hear that song that you first heard 20 years ago and you can still recall it and sing it like nothing, right? Never miss a beat. So that's a little bit about long-term memory and coding and perception. And then we are going to move a little bit more into perception right now, but you've got a little bit of background already. So perception, we perceive things, again, from what we hear, what we see, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch. So from all of our different senses, and also from our life experiences. So those life experiences in our environment can influence not only what we learn and how we perceive information, but also our beliefs and our behavior that you'll see subsequent to that. They impact how we see ourselves, right? And then the world around us, because what you believe, what you've learned is going to impact how you see people, places, things, how you understand and how you process information. And though we might have a lot of shared experiences, again, we can all be in the same room hearing the same message, how we receive that and how we perceive it is going to be different. And there's some other things that can influence that, like genetics. So genetics can actually influence our perception of things and how we respond to things. There have been some researchers who have tried to do different computer visual simulations to replicate perceptions in humans, but they haven't been able to do that because they can't teach or code into the computer how to make inferences. So I'm sure they're still working on that, and that will be very groundbreaking when it happens, but hasn't happened yet. A little bit more on perception. So factors such as perception and personality also influence our risk-taking behavior. So that risk-taking behavior can be things that we're taking risks at home on or things that we're taking risks at work on. But our perception and our personality is going to influence those risk-taking behaviors. when we're taking those risks, they fit into two different categories, and I'll show you a visual of what that looks like a little bit later. So that risk-taking behavior can be something that's routine, like cutting a corner, or it can be something that's more thrill-seeking that you do, which is I'm going to do this just because, or I want to show that I'm really brave, which, is not always a good idea. Those routine violations that involve cutting corners might be, well, I know that the procedure called for me to do A, B, C, and D, but if I cut out B, then that will save me some time. I'll still get to the same result. Nobody's going to miss that, but it's a corner that you cut. Those things can become habits though, and they can lead to errors. And I especially don't recommend that if you're trying to train somebody else on how to do something, that you train them on the way that you do it minus that corner that you cut. So you don't want to also have other folks falling into that same error trap from that. And then your thrill seeking or optimizing, those are things or risks that you take just because. So that would be likened to you just being or doing something very reckless. But all people do not perceive risk the same. So that thrill seeking person, that person that's doing it just because, might not actually see that as a risk-taking behavior, but for others of us, we might feel differently about it. We'll talk a little bit about encoding. So remember, we were going to talk about encoding, experiencing, and enculturate, but we had to get all the science out of the way first. We had to learn how the brain receives information and how we learn things, how those things that we learned are stored in our short-term memory and our long-term memory for recall sooner and later. And then we talked about perception, because what I think I might need to learn or take away from this, somebody else might not think the same. And that applies through all areas of our lives, either at work and at home. So encoding actually refers to how you receive and cement that information into your long-term memory. A few methods that I have used, a few encoding methods that I have used are self-reference, generation effect, and organizing information. With the self-reference effect, connections are made to things that you're familiar with to help you remember information. So an example of that is when I was studying situational awareness, I would relate the different levels of awareness to how aware I would be of something if I had my eyeglasses on versus if I had my eyeglasses off. So I also took how well I could see something in the daylight versus how well I could see something at night. The generation effect occurs when you create information yourself as opposed to receiving and remembering information that you get from other people or from other sources. I use this concept when I create my own presentations and then deliver them to people like you and to different other audience. So each time I deliver a presentation, I'm not doing a canned presentation like, okay, this was the one I did last month. I'm most familiar with it. I'm talking about the same thing. It's a different audience, but I'm going to give them the same information. I don't do that. Every presentation that I do, I cater it to that particular message or that particular audience. And that helps me to continue learning, remember Michelangelo, and to also help you all to be able to learn, because the better that I know information, the better I'll be able to share it and then help you if you have any questions about it. So organizing information uses patterns of data arrangement to help us remember and retrieve it later. An example of how I use organizing information would be the way that I keep all information that is related to a specific topic in a certain folder. So it may be a topic like everything about human performance goes here, everything about root cause goes here, or maybe it might be a certain organization. So all of my Georgia transmission stuff goes in this folder and all of my other stuff goes in this other folder. But however that ends up happening, keeping all of that related information in one folder for easy retrieval, because I know everything for that particular thing is going to be there later. It helps me before I get ready to go to work on something, so that I'm not trying to go and pull from a bunch of different places. I know that everything is in that one place. There's
Hey,
also
LaRhonda,
Mhm.
sorry to interrupt, but I think that Bob Latino has a question about brain one, brain two behaviors, and how our individual behaviors are impacted by or impacted how we learn. So, Bob,
Okay.
sorry to paraphrase badly, but I think go for it.
I'm asking now, LaRhonda, because my short-term memory is lost.
Okay.
But I hear presentations about brain one, brain two, conscious and subconscious, and how does something transition from being from the conscious state to becoming into your subconscious or automatic reflex?
So brain one and brain two, are you referring to system one and system two thinking?
Yeah, it's
So
similar.
your system one thinking is you immediately responding to something, right? Something happens, you immediately respond. You're not really thinking a whole lot about doing that. And your system two thinking is a much slower response to something. So you're taking a little bit more time to think about what just happened, to process that information so that you can bring forth some type of response. So your system one thinking, where you're pulling that information really quickly, well, that information is available for retrieval, and it could be because something just happened and you have that information readily available to you, which is similar to the recency effect that I'll talk about later. Or it could be because it is burned into your long-term memory, and now something has happened and you're able to respond to it readily, right? You don't have to go and ask somebody else for an answer. You've already had that experience, you have that knowledge, and you're able to respond in that system one or that very quick moment. And then your system two thinking, which entails a little bit more thinking about things, that could be because it is going to take you a little bit more time to retrieve that information from your long-term memory, because it has not just happened. And then when you think about what we just talked about, how we perceive things, well, somebody who is operating in system one thinking, we may perceive that they haven't really thought about what they said or what they did, but maybe they have, again, because they have that in their long-term memory. As opposed to somebody working in system two, we might perceive, rightly or wrongly, that hey, they took a little bit more time to process this and to think about it. They must know what they're doing. They must be giving me better information than this person working in system one who gave me that really quick response.
Okay, thank you. I just, I know there's got to be from a medical standpoint, a way that something makes it from the conscious to the subconscious to where it's an automatic reflex type of thing. And I've just personally, I've never understood how it makes its way through there, or how can you exercise your brain, if that's the way that you do it, to be able to make ourselves more conscious about making it subconscious. But I didn't mean to get in the way.
No. And there's different ways you do that. Like I said, different ways that you can encode those things in your brain, like with the chunking, where that's helping you to remember things, that's helping you to associate things. And then there's those other ways where, okay, I start off with bird, and then I get more specific as those things kind of work their way through my brain. The first thing that I see, that first stimuli that comes to me is bird. And then I remember, okay, it's not a bird, it's a canary. And that's based on other things that I have learned. And there are different exercises that you can do to help you to improve your short-term and your long-term memory and that recall.
Okay, but thank you, Dean, for posing the question, and thanks for answering it, LaRhonda.
You're welcome, and sorry I didn't see that.
I didn't even know how to raise my hand, so don't worry about that. That was in the short-term memory too.
All right. So there are different levels of processing that you can link to different types of encoding or to retrieval. Your memory actually depends on the depth of processing, and there's either a shallow or a deep processing. If you go through that shallow processing effort, then that involves very little attention. If you go through deep processing, well, then that involves a little bit more attention, and that is going to result in better memory. When we talk about retrieval, retrieval actually refers to how that data is recovered from your long-term memory, which is that question that Bob just asked. Your retrieval practices can include testing. So the testing effects actually proves that if you test yourself on information that you'll need to retrieve later, so a tip for you, Bob, such as on information that you'll need to know for a test that you're about to take, then that will yield positive results. I know that a lot of certifications that I've had to, get, there have been practice exams that have been associated with that. And sometimes I actually take advantage of those practice exams, and sometimes maybe not, but taking advantage of that testing helps to ensure that you're going to be ready for when you take that test. And again, that you'll have very positive results from that test taking. Retrieval cues can also help your memory. So retrieval cues are triggers or impetus that help you to recall information. Now, one retrieval cue that I use is creating acronyms for a series of information. And in my environment, we have lots and lots and lots of acronyms, but they're actually helpful. I hated them when I first got here, and I was like, why are there so many? But they actually help you to retrieve information later. So that's one of the methods that I use to remember things. Another retrieval method that I use is called encoding specificity. So encoding specificity helps with learning, retention, and retrieval. So it says that information that's encoded and retrieved that's in a similar location will be easier to remember. So if I've encoded it and retrieved it because it's something that I've seen and it's all there, well, that's going to be easier for me to remember later. And then another thing that I use is called the self-reference effect. And it says that memory is better about things that you relate to yourself. So whatever it is that you're thinking about or that you need to recall later, if there's some way that you can find to relate it to yourself or to an experience that you have had, then that will help you with recalling information later, like that bird that I was talking about. Oh, I see this bird. Again, I'm getting that visual cue or that stimuli. I remember when I was 5, I had a bird just like it, and this is the kind of bird that it was. Now I can remember all those different facts about that particular bird. So relating things to yourself and to your experience actually helps you to recall things later on. This is one of my favorite little slides. I should have used an example of a goldfish instead of a bird, but we're going to talk a little bit about attention, and I shared a little bit about attention with you a little bit earlier. So there are different types of attention. You have something called inattentional blindness, and that happens when you are unaware of stimuli that is clearly visible because you're not paying attention to it. So paying attention to one thing and not another thing happening in the same scene or in the same situation. And you can kind of go back to thinking about that situational awareness again. You see this one thing that's right in front of you. So, I see the house in front of me, but I don't see all the trees on fire all around me. So you're paying attention to one thing, but not other things that are in that same scene. Then you have something called inattentional deafness. So that happens when you're focusing on something. So you're looking at it and you're concentrating so hard that you actually can't hear things that are going on around you. So maybe you're in your office and you're working and, you know, your spouse and the kids are home from school and you're so busy concentrating on that thing that you're doing that you don't hear the kids screaming in the background or your spouse screaming at you to come and help them with the kids, right? So you're so focused on that one task that you don't hear things that are going on around you. And then there is something called selective attention. So that's attending to one thing while ignoring the others. So same example, I'm focused on my work. I don't hear the kids screaming and the spouse yelling at me in the background. I am choosing to or selecting to focus on my work right now. Then we have divided attention. So divided attention happens when you are paying attention to more than one thing at a time. And I'm sharing this with you, but I'm telling you, I don't necessarily like it because it makes people think that they can multitask. They kind of associate it with that. And there are only 2% of people in the world who can actually seriously, honestly multitask. But divided attention, paying attention to more than one thing at a time. Then we have something called dichotic listening. And that's listening to something different in each ear. So maybe you have your webinar going on right now and you're listening to me talk. And maybe also at the same time, you've got an earbud in and you're listening to music. So dichotic attention is you're listening to more than one thing at a time. They're in two different ears. And you can pay different levels of attention to things depending on what type of task you're doing. So if you're doing a low load task, which means you're doing something really easy, right? Like mopping the kitchen floor or something, then maybe I can also listen to music at the same time, or maybe watch TV at the same time, whatever that might be, because it's a low load task. It's something that's easy. But if you're doing a high load task or something that's pretty hard, then it's going to be a little bit more challenging for you to divide your attention if you are doing something that's hard, because that is going to increase your opportunity to make a mistake or to miss something that you really need to be paying attention to. Then we have something called change blindness. So change blindness happens when you have difficulty detecting that something in a scene has changed. So I use this example when I am talking to my system operators. So we have, I think it's like 12 by 18 is the size of the wall down in the control center. There's like 70 huge TV screens all put together so that they can see everything that's happening on our system. And each one of them has a different area that they're responsible for. So there's one person responsible for north and one person responsible for central and one person responsible for south. Well, that person in the north might be focused on their area, and that central person might come over and say, hey, I've got to step out for a second for a call. Can you keep an eye on the central over here? Well, that person might be so focused on their area, right? Because their area is north, that something could be happening over in the central where they were asked to watch out for, and they can't see it because their mind is focused exclusively and specifically on what's happening over in the north, so that when there's a change, when something happens somewhere else, they're not able to see it. And then there's something called scene schema. So that happens when you know what something is supposed to look like. So again, in my example with my system operators, like they're looking at this screen and they know what normal looks like, so that when something happens, and again, they're down there for like 12 hours a day, then they're not able to see it because they're so focused on that normal, okay, this is what the system should look like, and it's been looking this way for the past 10 hours. When something happens that at that 11th hour, they might miss it. So when a person is at attention, and we talked about all those different types and kinds of attention, they are better able to respond to different stimuli or different alerts from their environment. But if they're distracted or trying to divide their attention, then that causes our capacity for processing information to change. So we talked about low load and high load tasks. And whereas we would have been able to, if we were focused, to respond to things, if we're not focused, we're distracted or dividing our attention, then we're not able to. And I talked about attention spans. So we do have short attention spans. We are all forgetful. We are all distracted by whatever things we may be distracted by. And there was actually some research done by Wise Owl back in 2000. And back in 2000, the year 2000, the average attention span was 12 seconds. Well, fast forward 15 years to 2015, and the average attention span had actually decreased to 8.25 seconds. So that's less than a goldfish, because a goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds. And we talked about birthdays. There's a number of folks out there who actually forget their birthdays. 39% of folks actually lose an item at least once a week, which I found was really strange, but the research said that it happens. A little bit more on distraction. Office workers check their emails 30 times per hour. And I'm like, if you're checking your email 30 times per hour, well, how are you getting any work done? I don't know. And then this one, talk about distractions again. We pick up our phones 1,500 times a week. So, divide that by 7, that's over 200 times a day people are picking up their phones. And then if Jessica's still listening, sorry, Jessica, but folks leave a web page after only 10 to 12 seconds, and they're only likely to read about 20% of the content that is on that web page. So why am I telling you all of this? We want to make our messages short and clear and sweet. And to help us out, we can use stories and videos to grab the attention of those folks that might have zoned out after those 8.25 seconds. There's also some generational differences that are associated with attention. So let's just say I stop talking for a second. Well, the research proves that if I stop talking, about 77% of folks between the ages of 18 to 24 are going to pick up their phones and start doing whatever on their phones. That's compared to folks who are over the age of 65. Only about 10% of those people, when there's some silence in the room or there's a break, are going to pick up their phones. Phew, a lot on attention. So we're going to talk a little bit about some experiences and things of that nature. And then after we talk about that, we're going to move into enculturating and how to take everything that I've told you over this past hour and put that into practice and hopefully help you guys. So you're at work, right? Understanding your company's core values are very important. So the core values are those underlying set of beliefs and assumptions that an individual deems to be most important for himself or herself as it relates to their work group or their environment. There can be some trade-offs because you might think, well, I need to be more productive in the work that I'm doing, but the company actually wants to have me focus on this other thing. And that can lead to some unsafe behaviors when you're trying to decide whether or not I'm going to focus on being productive or I'm going to focus on these other things that I have here. So those core values and those things that your company wants you to do that they have set forth for you, they actually have to demonstrate that or be an example for you to that in order to reinforce that behavior in you. When it comes to the company's values, when you are living the company's values and asking your employees to affirm their values, that can also create some solidarity and a path forward, right? We're all on a united front. We all believe the same thing. And if you have a documented set of company values for the employees that they can go and they can refer to, or if you have some artifacts, and artifacts are things like cards that you can give them to put in their area, or maybe it's a screenshot on the computer or somewhere that they can go to see that, then that would help them to be reminded of what those values are, and they will act accordingly. There are some pulse surveys that have been done about values, and those pulse surveys help us to be able to gauge whether or not our company values are in line with those things that people believe, and then the way that they subsequently behave in response to that. And we can take the results of those surveys to either change those values or to reinforce those behaviors that we want to see our employees do, which would support continuous improvement throughout the organization. Creativity. We're going to talk about that a little bit. So creativity is not a new word, it's not a new concept. The history of creativity itself actually goes all the way back to the Romans and the Greeks and the Renaissance period and the period of Enlightenment, all the way up to where we are now. So in the past, we have studied creativity through different trends and through different stages of development. And there are a lot of different factors that can influence creativity. And there's different ways that creativity can manifest itself throughout our lifespan as an individual. Some people might think that we were a lot more creative when we were younger than we are as we have matured. But genetics can also play a part in creativity, as well as your personal experiences. Your actual genetics may predispose you to being creative in a certain way. And I think about that a lot because my dad, before he retired, was a master carpenter. And even though, like, after school every day I would go and I would sit and I would watch him work, so I learned what different tools are and how to do different things. As I got older, I also was akin to wanting to work with my hands, but I was working with my hands in a different way, and I was creating things in a different way. So those genetics can actually predispose you to certain levels of creativities, and there might be different opportunities that are available to you in response to that, especially if you decide that you want to nurture that creativity. And going back to perception and such, some people who have been labeled as exceptionally creative have also been correlated with folks who take a lot of risks. So I thought that that was very interesting when I learned that. Even though genetics can kind of predispose you to creativity, there is no one trait, there's no secret sauce about creativity. Your creativity can be comprised of those things that you learn. It can be those genetics. It can be different experiences that you have, but you can take and you can distinguish them from other individuals. So we're all not going to be creative in the same way either, because we all haven't had those certain experiences or that certain education. But all of those things do influence that creative process. So a person with a creative personal identity or personality, they're going to weave creativity into every single thing that they do. And there's one quote that I like from Helen Keller, and she says that I cannot always distinguish my own thoughts from those that I read, because what I read becomes the very substance and texture of my mind. So going all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to now, I thought that that was very apropos from Helen Keller. Now, companies that are creative and innovative, they're going to have a competitive edge because those organizations are adaptable, they're flexible, they're strategic, they're great decision makers, they're very customer centric, they're very responsive, they're very proactive, and they're very committed to the research and development that it takes to get to that level. I'm going to high level give you some things about experiences. So we all have lots of different experiences that we have that we kind of bring into the work environment. And those experiences, I'm also going to relate a little bit back to memory and things that we talked about earlier. So when you first go into an organization, you might have a learning curve because maybe you have a degree in this thing, or maybe you've done this same job in another company, but there's still going to be a learning curve, and some proactive interference can occur when you are trying to learn what it is that you have to do in this new job. And that proactive interference actually is a decrease in the memory because you're still holding on to, or you're still retaining that previously learned information. So it's preventing you from being able to learn the new stuff that you're here to do. So that's kind of where that learning curve and memory comes into place. You also might have, when you get to your new place, or maybe someone that you're carrying over from your old place, a mentor-mentee experience where you have someone else who is listening to you and leading you and guiding you, and they are helping you to curate those very specific experiences that you will carry into your new environment. There are things that are related to your health, and we are hopefully, I'm hoping, fingers and toes crossed and all the prayers, on the tail end of a pandemic. Well, all of those health related things and those things from that environment impact those experiences that we have here at work and how we behave and how we respond. One of the things that we did here, I'm going to use my control center example again, is when the pandemic hit, we couldn't have everybody in that same space anymore. So we actually have a backup control center, and we had some people here in our primary control center. We had some people in our backup control center because we wanted to keep everybody healthy. And we had folks where we knew if something happened, right, you're in this particular environment. So we didn't necessarily have that cross-pollination when the shift changes from, one 12-hour person to the next 12-hour person. But those things still impacted how we worked on the system, because if somebody is not healthy, whether it's in the control room or in the field where I work and where my people work, then that is going to impact their experience and their ability to cause an error or an incident or an accident. And then there's the environment, and there's different types of environment. And sometimes when I talk about environment, I talk about organizational culture, and I also talk about the culture outside of this building, because all of that impacts how we show up in our experiences and how we respond. So in our environment here, we are owned, if you will, by electric member cooperatives. So there's 38 electric member cooperatives, or EMCs. And what we have learned recently is that 95% of our EMC territory covers what the census folks says are disadvantaged areas in the state of Georgia. So we know that when we are entering into those environments, we have to be especially sensitive, because even though, we're the power company and hey, we're coming to bring you power and everybody should be happy because, you can do all the things you need to do, they may not receive, we talked about perception, that the same way. So we do environmental justice studies so that we can have actual information to share with everyone that, hey, we're not negatively impacting your environment. We actually are here to help, and here is how we're doing it. So we have to understand our environment to make sure that we're able to get our work done, that we have a good experience there, and that the people who we are impacting also do. There are also things related to silence and then conversely music that impact our experience. And again, that's all based on your perception too. I know folks who can listen to music very loud and music very crazy and get things done. But me, myself, I actually have to work in silence because in my mind, going back to attention, I can't divide those things. So whether your environment is a silent one or one that is filled with music, and I know they say classical music will actually help you be smarter and such, all of those things are going to impact your experience. And then there's different types of experiences, right? And we all want to make sure that we're having very authentic experiences. And the authentic experiences that I have been able to create in my environment, we have about 300 associates here at Georgia Transmission, but we're a part of a family of companies. So those other 2 companies, you add them in, we have over 1,000 people. That's a lot of folks. So starting with my people, it's me and 30 guys. I create authentic experiences with them from the moment that I onboard them until I release them out into the field. I make sure I know who they are as people. I know their wives and their husbands and their dogs and their grandkids. I know what they like to do on the weekends. And when I am reaching back out to them, I make sure that I am I'm nurturing those connections, because them knowing that we care for them here is going to impact how they are working out in the field. And in the field is building high voltage substations and transmission lines. So that work is inherently dangerous. So we need to make sure that we have created those authentic experiences. We have those connections with them. We know them so that if something does happen, we are able to easily recognize and then respond to that. Being able to solve problems, which can also tie back to creativity, is very important in your experience, especially because here we work in a lot of teams. So we bring a lot of subject matter experts together to try to solve problems. So when we are able to do that, because we're able to work together well, then that is going to be something that's going to be a good experience, not just for the people in the room because they're learning and they're building relationships, but also for our customers. Burnout and exhaustion, it's a real thing, especially now. You know, I know when COVID first happened and we were all on little boxes on little screens, we started to kind of get that screen fatigue. And then when things went on so long, then now we've got COVID fatigue. And that exhaustion and that burnout they're both error precursors. So if you're burnt out, if you're exhausted, if you're not getting enough sleep, and when I say enough sleep, that means getting more than 6 hours a day, because if you get anything less than 6 hours a day, then you are not going to be as productive and as alert as you need to be. All of those things will lead to error precursors. And then there's awe. So, you know, you step out of the building, you step out of your house, you look up at the sky, and the sky is so big, it's so massive, and you realize that there are things out there that are bigger than you, and the sky is beautiful and everything is great, and you're able to intake that awe, and you've had those few minutes where you were able to recharge, and you're able to come back into work or come back into your home office and work, you know, and provide a better experience for the people that you work with as well as yourself. And then celebrating small wins. We always want to make sure that we do that. All of those milestones that we reach, we don't wait until we've eaten the whole apple or the whole elephant. Every little bite that we take that ends up in a success or getting us a step closer to where we need to be, we want to make sure that we celebrate those things. We're going to talk a tad bit about psychological safety. So psychological safety is a term that was first coined by a Harvard professor named Amy Edmondson. And psychological safety in the workplace is you believing that if something does happen, that you're able to speak up and that you're not going to be punished because you spoke up. And then you want to make sure, especially if there's any leaders, that you have established a climate to which people in your organization know that they can come to you if something does happen, and you remember I talked about authentic experiences, I know you. So that makes it a little bit easier to go to you if something happens, but you want to establish that climate within your organization and within your workers so that if something happens, they will come to you and let you know. And you want to make sure that that's the norm, like that's not just the exception. Because when those things happen, again, you can decrease the opportunity that you're going to have any errors or accidents because people are coming to you. They're not out there hiding things or trying to solve issues themselves. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who feel like they cannot go to their leaders and talk to them when something happens. And unfortunately, a lot of those people include women. There are only about 1 in 5 women who feel like they can go to their leadership to tell them when something has happened. So again, we want to make sure that we are establishing very psychologically safe environments for our folks, which includes watching our language. We don't want to have blame-based languages in our organization, because when you have blame-based language, then that does not equate to, and that does not get you to a psychologically safe environment. So if something happens, don't ask who. That's blame-based. We don't do that. But we want to use other words that, especially if we are going to have to look a little bit more into something, that will lead people to feel like they can be more open and more responsive to what it is that you are asking them. Words that will make them feel like they have permission to actually respond to you and like you're actually hearing them, and that what you say is not going to be critical of what they have done. And a little bit more about work, we're going to talk a little bit about Maslow's needs at work. And this is a picture of the hierarchy of needs at work. So when you're in a psychologically safe environment, that environment makes you have a feeling of belonging. And we want to make sure that our employees' basic needs are met, so that they have the pay and the benefits that they need so they can function on their work, and they're not functioning on or focusing on how they're going to pay the bills. They are focused on their work because they are being compensated fairly for the work that they do. And that can also be related to something called the subjective well-being index. And the subjective well-being index says that if everybody have what they need to be happy, and there's actually a number attached to that, and that number is $75,000 a year. So if you are being paid at least $75,000 a year, according to the subjective well-being index, not me, then you will have all those things that you need to be happy, and then you can focus on climbing up the ladder of these other 4 things. So that next thing is safety at work. So we want to make sure that everybody feels safe, that going back to that blame-based language, they're not feeling like they're being blamed or criticized for anything, that they won't be harassed or bullied or even excluded from any of the things that might be happening at work. And I can tell you that when I come to our campus every day, that first thing that I see as it applies to safety is a DeKalb County police officer. So we start there, and then once we enter into the building, then we look at all of those other things. And then belonging, I'm sure you all have heard of work friends. So we want to make sure that everybody feels like they belong and that they're making connections at work, and that everybody is feeling respected for the work that they're doing. So then they have really good self-esteem about that work, and they're actually being recognized for the work that they're doing. So they are the subject matter experts or the go-to person for a particular subject. A tiny bit about just culture. That just culture means that there's some shared accountability, right? So we're not doing any blaming. We're making sure that our environments are psychologically safe and everybody is doing what they are there to do, and that the organizations are making sure that that is actually enforced and that everybody is being treated fairly and justly. When you have a just culture, when you have a psychologically safe environment, those things also actually reinforce the principles of human performance. And we're going to talk a little bit about those too. When you, as an organization, also remove obstacles for your employees, which is very essential, then you don't have a failure from flow of information, right? People are working in silos and nobody is sharing information with each other. So we want to make sure that we are removing obstacles from whatever those environments might be, whether it's a design that you're working on in the office or something that you're doing out in the field. We want to remove those obstacles. We want to make sure that information flows both ways in the office to the field, back and forth, and that your leadership actually supports that they are helping to make that happen. We talked a little bit about blame and not blaming anybody and such, and making sure that everybody is accountable. Well, there's a way to make sure that you still maintain a psychologically safe work environment and a just culture. But if something happens, then you can use this chart, which is the culpability model or the culpability tree, to make sure that if you have to administer any punishment, that you are doing it the same way each time, that it is objective and not subjective. You can also do things like the foresight test or the substitution test, which is like, hey, if I was in the same situation, I would have done the same thing. So, but there's other ways and other things that you can do along with this culpability tree to make sure that if someone did do something, we talked about different types of violations, routine, and thrill seeking, that you are administering any punishment that you might have to do the same way each time. You all have probably heard what gets measured gets rewarded. So there are different behavior management systems that you can use, again, to make sure that if something does happen, that you are giving that same either reward or punishment, being very objective in the way that you do that. And those rewards can be financial or they can be non-financial. Like, okay, you did something great, you get a raise, or you get a bonus, or you get a promotion, right? You've got another title, and sometimes that comes with more money too. But you want to make sure that whatever it is that you do, it's all in line with your company's values and your goals and your mission, and that it's not discrediting any of the work that's been done by anybody or the system. There are also ethical and unethical punishments, and you can determine, again, using that culpability model or the foresight test or the substitution test, whether or not those punishments fit in either one of those buckets. And there's observation and coaching. So we do a lot of observation and coaching here, and we are currently working on an observation and coaching program. But sometimes when a person thinks that they are being observed by somebody else, then they might become very apprehensive. So we're making sure that as we develop our program, that we are cognizant of that. So that evaluation might lead them to also perform differently, right? Because I'm being watched. So I'm not going to perform the same way that I would if I was not being watched. But conversely, that might also make people perform better because they are. So we want to make sure, again, that when we are developing observation and coaching programs, and when we're doing observation and coaching in the office or out in the field, that we take all of those things into account, and that the feedback that we are giving is constructive and designed to actually help to boost productivity with our employees, and that is going to be beneficial for that person and for the corporation. And we want to make sure that when we're doing that observation and coaching, that we're not being a distraction to the person that is working. Then there's leadership and power, and there are 5 different types of power, and those are expert, referent, reward, legitimate, and coercive. And those things are important because sometimes you are in a position at work where you're not in an official leadership capacity, right? Your title doesn't say that you're CEO or CFO, or you're not a manager or a supervisor or anything like that. But if you exercise the different types of power that you do have, which are these that I've stated, then those can help you to influence the individuals that you work with. So your expert power is your power of knowledge, right? We talked about Maslow's hierarchy of need and people recognizing you as a subject matter expert. So you can use that expert power, or that power that you have as being a subject matter expert, to influence other individuals. And then referent power is the power that a leader has based on his relationship with his followers. And I don't necessarily like the word followers, but that's what it is. And you can liken that to those authentic experiences that we talked about, and how I told you that when I onboard people, I make sure that I develop those authentic relationships with them, that I have authentic experiences with them, so that if I do need to influence them to do anything down the line, then I can kind of wield that, if you will, and it's not because I'm their manager or serve in any other capacity that's, likened to that. Then you have legitimate power, and legitimate power is the power of a leader based on his or her role in the organization. So that it is your manager, that is your CEO, that is your CFO, and they're able to influence people because of their title or their leadership role. And then you have reward power. So reward power is a power that a leader has based on his or her ability to provide positive outcomes for their followers. So, maybe I can help you to get that promotion, or maybe I can help you to get that raise, and I'll use my influence or my power, my legitimate power, to do that. And then you have coercive power, and coercive power is the power that a leader has based on his or her ability to impose negative consequences. So we talked about rewards and punishment earlier. Well, maybe I can demote you, or maybe I can fire you, or maybe I can take money out of your check, and a person can influence individuals based on their ability to exert that negative influence on them. And then teamwork is a part of our experience here at Georgia Transmission. And there are different ways that teams are formed, right? So the 4 stages of team development are forming and storming and norming and performing. And then that 5th stage is adjourning. So when you first get together and start working together in a team, you are going to have some tug of war there as people try to assert themselves. Either I want to be the leader, or I'm the subject matter expert, or whatever. You're going to have some social loafers in there. So they might say, you know what, I'm going to sit back and just watch what happens and take credit at the end with everybody else. So once you kind of get past that part, you all start working with some level of normalcy, or as things were scoped out, if you will, to be, you'll all perform well, you'll get your tasks done, and then you all will adjourn as a team and go on to that next task or that next thing that you are designed to do.
Hey, LaRhonda.
Yes.
I'm just going to jump in because we have about 4 or 5 minutes left before we start. People move on to other commitments. So I'm just wondering if you'll have a couple minutes for any Q&A.
Well, I can stop here if you'd like to. So what I have left to talk to you about is why all of this matters, which is the slide that we're on, and then how I've put these things into practice here. So I can take questions now.
Well, why don't we do this? And
Okay.
and so and I apologize for interrupting your flow. So I think, why don't you just keep going the way you are going to go, just recognizing that people may have planned on leaving at 12:30 Eastern time, so we might lose a couple people. What I'd encourage everybody to do, and LaRhonda, I'll have one more question for you. Everybody, if you have questions, feel free to chat them into the chat box. LaRhonda, do you mind if I put your email address into the chat box in case people have follow-up questions and they do have to leave? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. And I
Cool.
apologize for
No, thanks for the letting me
going over.
interrupt you rudely. I appreciate it.
No, it's not you, it's me. So yes, please leave any questions that you might have in the chat box, and apologies for, running up to 12:30 there. But I guess, Dean, do you or Bob or Jessica have any other commitments too that I need to be kind of watching the time for?
I only have at 12:45 Eastern time, I need to go for another commitment.
All right, so.
So I'll stick with you. And I think others will too. We'll just lose a few people.
Okay, well, going back to attention, I'll make sure I kind of blow through this and get it done really quick, and then they can send me questions. So why does all of this matter? Because errors happen and errors cost money. And you can see by this slide what that actually looks like. So Citigroup had a clerical error that cost them $1 billion. The Virginia government had a spreadsheet error which caused 500,000 absentee applications to be sent to the wrong place. And we all know how folks get around politics and such. So that was not good. And then poor communication in general actually costs companies $1.2 trillion per year. And then we talked about sharing knowledge and not working in silos. Well, 31.5 billion with a B is what we lose due to not sharing information. We all might be familiar with the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Well, hefty price tag associated with that, 40 billion with a B dollars. And then something that may be close to all of us, medical errors. Used to be, when we first started counting that, it was about 40,000 to 90,000 errors per year that were attributed to medical accidents. Well, now that number is upwards of over 200,000 people per year dying due to medical errors. So that's why all of this matters. And then if you use your human performance principles, that can help you to reduce the opportunity that you have any errors. And these are those 5. We all know that people are fallible. Everybody makes mistakes. Mistakes are going to happen. Your individual behavior is influenced by your organization. We talked about organizational values and knowing what those are, and that people are influenced by that, and that we have to lead by example. That people achieve high levels of success if we provide them encouragement. So, hey, attaboy, pat on the back, all of that good stuff. And if we study these things, then we can avoid those events happening in the future. Lots of benefits associated with employing our human performance tools. Oops, sorry. But we're going to get better at what we do. We're going to work safely. We're not going to have as many errors. People are going to start reporting things because they feel like they are working in psychologically safe environments. We are going to have better trust among the people that we work with. There's going to be more engagement, and people are going to work well together. And some leaders are actually going to emerge from all of that. The best approach, and what we have found that works here, is a hybrid approach. So we have our top down and our bottom up. We have our leaders who have kind of set the tone, they have set the example, but we have our folks who are boots on the ground who also contribute largely to the things that we do here. They are our subject matter experts. There's ways that you all, whether you are working remotely or in the office, can help your peers out. You can ask them questions, ask them good questions, ask them probing questions, ask them open-ended questions. You can listen and make sure that you're actively listening. You can share your failures, because when you're sharing your failures, that actually helps other people. It also helps people to see that you're being authentic and creating those authentic experiences that we talked about. Make sure you give them very candid feedback, that feedback is very honest, but it's respectful. Ask for help when you need it. Trust your subject matter experts. That's why we have them all here. Make sure that you say thank you, extend that grace, and then stay positive. And then you will be supporting your peers. There's different things that leadership can do. They can make psychological safety a priority. They can make sure that they facilitate an environment where everybody speaks up. They can establish norm for how failure is handled. create space for new ideas, and then embrace productive conflict. You might be saying, how can I do that here? There's different ways you can do it. You can have your elevator pitch, and anybody have questions about elevator pitches, I can tell you how to build one, but you put those different aspects of your elevator pitch together somewhere from 15 to 20 seconds, and you can drop it on whoever it is you need to drop it on, which will lead to another conversation later, and it will help you to get your message out widely. And then enculturating, some things that we do event learnings here. When something happens, we provide that timely feedback. Everything is transparent, again, not working in silos, and we trust that our people are our experts. We do presentations at safety meetings and associates meetings, and we insert different types of education on those human performance and psychological safety and just culture concepts. We make sure that basic training is always available. So if you need a refresher, you can go and grab that. And we do coaching to address any challenges that we might have with employees. And if good behaviors are happening, going back to our human performance, we want to make sure that we acknowledge that as well. We adhere to all of our standards and best practices, and there are a lot of them working in a utility. We do have executives who endorse the work that we're doing. We are embracing technology, so we've got all these bots and such that we're working with now. And we make sure that we work across organizations. So a lot of times when something happens and I'm doing an event learning, I actually have to work with those other two sister companies to make that change happen and to understand what actually happened. And then we actively manage change, right? We don't say, oh, this is the solution and everybody walks away. We actively manage any change, and we make sure that what we do adds value. So we're not changing just for the sake of change, but that change that we do actually adds value. We make sure that we participate in industry groups and events like this one. And we have folks who have some flexible work schedules. So Mondays and Fridays, good luck finding somebody. We make sure that we focus on wellness because, as we talked about earlier, being well, being healthy is going to help us to learn, retain, and perform better. We do knowledge transfer, especially because over 50% of our people who work here are over the age of 50. And then we have a very collaborative culture, again, always working in teams and making sure that we're actively listening to folks. We do have human performance advocates here that help us to spread the word about how to use our different tools and techniques to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to mitigate any potential issues so that we're working as close to error-free as we can be. We reinforce a just culture. We create a psychologically safe environment. We make sure everybody knows what their roles and responsibilities are. So, not playing in your sandbox. Everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. And then we have humble empathy. We're creating those authentic experiences so we understand and we're able to extend that grace when we need to. We make sure that we have adequate resources. So that might mean actual people, or that might mean actual tools. And then we're very inclusive in the things that we're doing. So we're not just inviting you to the meeting or giving you a seat at the table, but we're making sure that you're actually involved in things that happen. And we know it's working because the landscape is changing. We're doing more coaching, and we're making sure that if we have to administer punishment, that is very well vetted. We are responding to behaviors that introduce risk when it happens, so we don't have any latent organizational weaknesses there. We have more people coming to us, asking us to help them, and then people feel heard, right? And then we are challenging people to challenge other folks when they notice something that might not be right. And I believe that you all can do this. Make sure you continue communicating and creating psychologically safe environments. Make sure you're a part of the movement to set the tone for the culture across your organization, because you can get there. You can get to a psychologically safe workplace. You can get to a just culture. You just have to understand what the challenges are. You have to know your people so that you can improve those outcomes. Remember, a hybrid approach, leadership, workers, everybody works together. know the basics and the benefits, remember that hierarchy of needs that we talked about, and make sure that you're connecting with your people, that you know them before you go out there and try to correct them through any type of observation or coaching. This is one of my favorite slides, one of my favorite things. We need more fences at the tops of cliffs rather than more ambulances at the bottom. So we need more training like this. We need more tools. We need more resources. We need more subject matter experts to make sure that we are proactive in mitigating things as opposed to responding and reacting to accidents. And thank you, thank you, thank you. And here is my information and my email address again. And so sorry for going over, but thank you so much to the folks who held on. Please do feel free to email me and I will do my best to help you. And then this is where we wanted to be at 12:30.
Awesome.
Find out if
Thank
anybody
you.
had any questions.
Yeah, let's see if anybody wants to chat into the chat box or raise a hand. And while we're waiting to see if someone does, LaRhonda, here's my question for you. Well, not even question. Thank you. I appreciate connecting all the dots between how we think and learn and absorb information or filter it out, which happens in a human brain, to what do we do with it? What do we do with it as a leader or as an employee or as a mom or a dad or a brother or sister, so all the way through. I appreciate everything you shared. So here's my question, though. If I think about all the moving pieces, in the first part of your discussion about how the human body, the human brain works, how we bring in information, what we do with it, there's obviously lots of gaps. Well, and I'll raise my hand all the way through that system. How do we know where our weakest link is and improve it systematically? Is there an aptitude testing tool like I took in high school that said I should be a firefighter? Is there something that says, here's what you're good at related to how you think, to paraphrase, or here's what you're bad at, so we know what to practice on?
There are, but a lot of those things and a lot of your decision to pursue those things are also subjective. You might say, I've got a bad memory. I want to find some tools on how to be better at memory. And I outlined what some of those are, but you can do those things. And there's lots of those free things out there. I was actually listening to a podcast this morning that shared some information on behaviors and bias. And Harvard University actually has a website that you can go to where you can take tests on all of your different types of behaviors, and it'll tell you where you are weak at, where you have deficits, and then you can find out where you need to go, if you will, to improve, if that's what you want to do.
Thank you. I think that's probably helpful for a lot of people. I mean, not for me because I'm perfect, but for a lot of people, I think that's really helpful. No, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'll look to see if there's any other chats or hands raised, and there aren't. So overall, thank you very much. I appreciate a lot of those little insights that you shared about, really thinking through what a story means to you before you make a presentation or a topic means to you. So you're not just, you're really engaging people. And I genuinely appreciate that. And I also love that you touched on creativity, because that relates to next month. Laura Flessner from MindTap will be with us to talk about how do you take innovation and creative ideas and bring them to practical application. So she's sort of, in some ways building on what you touched on today. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I do, again, maybe because I'm nerdy, but I do like to take you all the way back to getting you to understand the fundamentals before I give you that idea, because I try not to assume that people know that, right? Like, oh, you're coming to a webinar to learn about encoding information. Well, how does that information even get into your brain? So I do try to be thoughtful about who my target audience is going to be. I don't assume that everybody knows what I'll be talking about. So I do try to set that stage, and hopefully that was helpful to the people that were on the call.
Hey, on behalf of everybody, I think it was super helpful. And, so I've never even been anywhere that a word like proposagnosia, whatever it was even spoken, let alone that it was a thing. So thank you for that depth, and happy birthday in advance.
Thank you.